Most people don't think they have a debt problem. They're not behind on payments, they haven't missed a bill. From the outside, everything looks fine. But there's a version of debt that doesn't feel like debt. It doesn't announce itself, it just stays. And the people carrying the most of it are often the ones who consider themselves financially responsible. That's the trap. Not the obvious kind, the payday loans, the maxed out cards with nothing to show for them. The invisible kind. The kind that hides inside normal decisions. The kind that gets reinforced every time you get a raise, land a better job, or feel like you're finally making progress. If you work a 9 to 5 and you've ever felt like your money disappears faster than it arrives, this is worth understanding. Because what most people call just life is actually a set of financial patterns. And those patterns have a cost that most people never stop to add up. Let's start with something most people get completely wrong. There's a belief, almost a cultural one, that debt is bad only when it becomes a crisis. When your credit score tanks. When collectors start calling. Short of that, we treat debt as neutral. Just a tool. Something to manage, not something to question. But this framing quietly lets a lot of financial damage go unexamined. Because the damage doesn't look like damage, it looks like a reasonable monthly payment. Think about how a normal working adult builds their life. They get their first real job. They move into a decent apartment, probably spending more than they should, but it feels earned. They finance a car because they need one. Maybe they carry a few $100s on a credit card most months. Small stuff. Nothing crazy. Then they get a raise, the apartment upgrades, the car payment gets a little bigger, the card balance climbs too, but slowly. None of these individual decisions looks like a problem. Together, though, they form something that never quite gets paid down. A baseline level of financial obligation that simply moves with you, growing quietly as your income grows. That's not managing debt. That's being anchored to it. Here's what makes this particularly difficult to see. The anchor doesn't feel heavy when life is going well. Monthly payments get made, there's still money left over. On the surface, things look stable. But stability and progress are not the same thing. Stability means you're holding your position. Progress means the position is changing. And for a lot of people earning decent money, people who work hard, show up every day, do everything right by conventional standards, the position hasn't changed in years. What's actually happening is that most of the income gets pre-committed before a single intentional decision is made. Rent goes out automatically. The car note hits on the 15th. Subscriptions bleed out all month long. By the time real discretionary money is available, there isn't much of it. And so saving stays at the bottom of the priority list. Not because the intention isn't there, but because the structure of life has already allocated most of the money before there's any real choice involved. This is different from spending too much on restaurants or buying things you don't need. Those are behavior problems. What we're talking about is a structural problem, one that most financial advice doesn't actually address, because most financial advice focuses on behavior: spend less, track more, cut back here. But the real issue isn't the spending decisions you make day to day. It's the structural commitments you made months or years ago that automatically drain the account before the day even starts. Consider this scenario. Two people both earn $60,000 a year. Person A has rent and a car payment that together total $2,200 a month. Person B has the same income but structured their fixed costs to come in at $1,400 a month. Same salary. $800 difference in monthly breathing room. That's $9,600 a year available for saving, investing, or actually getting ahead. Person A isn't in crisis. Person B isn't a genius. The only difference is how much financial obligation each person locked in before they started living. Most people never make this calculation deliberately. They decide what they can afford based on what the monthly payment looks like. Not what it costs over the full term, not what it prevents them from building, just whether this month is manageable. And this is where the psychological side of debt starts to matter more than the financial side. Debt, especially the kind attached to lifestyle, is almost always emotional before it's financial. The car isn't just transportation, it's how you show up to the job where you worked hard to get promoted. It's what you drive past people who knew you when you had nothing. It's a visible symbol of a life that's moving in the right direction. The apartment isn't just where you sleep. It reflects the life you believe you're building, the version of yourself you've been working toward. There's nothing wrong with wanting those things. The problem is that the way most people fund them through monthly obligations that persist for years trades future financial freedom for a present feeling of arrival. And that trade gets repeated every few years. New car, bigger place, a little more comfort, Each cycle feels like forward motion. Financially, it often isn't. It's lateral motion with a higher price tag. There's a concept worth sitting with here. Imagine a line, your income line. Now, imagine another line running just beneath it, your obligation line. Everything above the obligation line is what you actually control. Everything below it is already spent before you wake up. For a lot of 9 to 5 workers, those two lines are uncomfortably close together. Not because income is too low, though that's a real issue for many people, but because the obligation line keeps rising to match the income line. Every time there's more money, there's more commitment, more car, more space, more subscriptions, more monthly minimums. The gap never really widens. And the gap is exactly where wealth is built, not the income, the gap. This is why two people can have completely different financial outcomes on identical salaries. One protected the gap, one let it close. That single difference, compounded over a decade, creates outcomes that look like they came from entirely different income levels. Now, debt itself isn't the enemy. That framing is too simple and not particularly useful. There's a meaningful difference between debt that builds something, a home in an appreciating area, an education that increases earning power, equipment that generates income, and debt that funds the ongoing maintenance of a lifestyle. Lifestyle debt is the quiet kind. It's the furniture financed over 18 months. It's the vacation on a card that doesn't get fully paid off. It's the new phone on a payment plan because the upfront cost feels too high. It's the balance that gets transferred to a 0% offer and then somehow grows again. None of these are catastrophic. All of them, stacked and repeated over years, create a financial structure that becomes very hard to dismantle, because every time you try to get ahead, the structure is already in place. The minimums are already owed, the commitments are already made, and the money that should be building something is already spoken for. There's something else here that doesn't get talked about enough: the cost of inertia. Inertia, financially, is the tendency to keep spending at the level your life is currently set up for. It doesn't require bad intentions. It doesn't require recklessness. It just requires doing nothing, which is what most people do most of the time. The car lease ends and you get another one. The apartment lease renews and you stay. The subscription renews and you don't cancel it. The card balance stays roughly where it's been for 2 years because you're making progress but not quite enough. Every one of these default choices locks in another cycle of obligation. And over 5 or 10 years, the accumulated weight of those defaults can be the difference between someone who has real options and someone who doesn't. Here's a number that tends to land differently once you actually sit with it. If you carry $3,000 on a credit card at an average interest rate and you pay only the minimum each month, you will end up paying more than double the original amount by the time it's gone. That same $3,000 balance could take between 10 and 15 years to fully clear. $3,000. That's not a crisis amount. That's a number a lot of working people consider perfectly manageable. But manageable and affordable are not the same thing. Manageable means the payment fits in the budget. Affordable means the total cost makes sense when you account for what else that money could have done. When people ask where their money went, the honest answer is often this: a meaningful portion went to interest. Interest on things they no longer own. Interest on experiences that are years in the past. Interest on a version of their life that has already moved on. That's what makes this type of debt so quietly corrosive. It charges you for the past while limiting what you can do with the future. It's a financial time machine that only goes in one direction. And the particularly frustrating part is that the people most caught in this pattern are often not irresponsible. They're working hard, they're paying their bills, they're doing what they were told would work. They just weren't told about the structural ceiling that comes with running life at full capacity financially. So what actually changes the trajectory? Not willpower, not motivation. Those things are real, but they're unreliable over long time horizons. You can't white-knuckle your way through 10 years of financial discipline. What changes it is design. Building a financial structure that doesn't depend on perfect behavior every month. One that works even when life gets busy, stressful, or complicated, which is most of the time. The people who actually escape the pattern, who widen the gap and keep it wide, tend to do a few specific things differently. The first shift is evaluating decisions based on total cost, not monthly cost. When you're looking at a car, the question isn't whether you can handle the payment. The question is what the total cost of ownership looks like over 3 years: purchase price, interest, insurance, maintenance, depreciation. When that full number is visible and real, the decision looks completely different. A car that feels affordable at $400 a month can easily cost you $25,000 over its ownership period once everything is factored in. Is that the best use of $25,000 from your specific financial position? That's the question worth asking. Most people never ask it. The second shift is treating savings as a fixed obligation, not as what's left over. This sounds simple. In practice, it's one of the hardest behavioral changes to actually make, because it requires deciding in advance that a certain amount of money is already gone before you know what else might come up that month. Most people save whatever remains after everything else is paid, which means most months they save very little. Flipping this, deciding the savings number first, and building life around what remains is one of the few structural moves that consistently works across different income levels. Not because it's magical, because it forces the obligation line downward rather than letting it drift up to meet the income line. The third shift is auditing fixed costs regularly, not discretionary spending. There's an entire industry built around helping people track where they spent their money last month. Apps, spreadsheets, budgeting systems. Most of it focuses on the variable stuff: coffee, dinners, impulse purchases. But the real leverage is in the fixed costs, the recurring commitments that don't require any decision to continue: rent, car payment, insurance, loan minimums, subscriptions. These numbers define the financial floor, and most people haven't seriously questioned them since the day they agreed to them. A thorough review of fixed costs, asking which ones still serve you, which have quietly increased, which are funding something that stopped mattering a long time ago, can free up more money than almost any day-to-day spending adjustment. Because these aren't one-time decisions. They're decisions that affect every single month going forward. The fourth shift is learning to be skeptical of normal. Normal, financially, is financing a car. Normal is carrying a balance most months. Normal is upgrading your life every time income rises. Normal is treating debt as something to manage rather than eliminate. Normal also leads to the median financial outcome, which, for most working adults approaching their 50s, is genuinely uncomfortable to look at. Not because people were careless, but because normal was the benchmark and normal didn't account for the structural ceiling. The people who build real financial momentum inside a 9-to-5 income don't necessarily out-earn everyone around them. They just stop using the behavior of the people around them as the measure of what's appropriate. They measure against what they want their financial future to look like. That shift changes what feels like a sacrifice and what feels like a strategy. It's also worth being honest about the social dimension of all of this. Choosing to live below the level your income could support isn't purely a financial decision. It's a social one. It often means driving a car that doesn't match your title, living in a place that doesn't broadcast your salary, saying no to things your peers are saying yes to. That friction is real. It's not weakness to feel it. We're wired to calibrate to the people around us. That instinct made a lot of sense for most of human history. It just doesn't serve you particularly well when the people around you are all quietly trapped in the same pattern. Here's the thing though, the discomfort of living below your means for a few years is temporary. The consequence of spending up to your means for a few decades is not. One creates options, the other removes them. And financial options, real ones, change the actual experience of working. The ability to leave a job that's become intolerable without a financial emergency. The ability to take a risk on something you actually want to build. The ability to absorb an unexpected cost without going backwards for 6 months. The ability to stop working not because you have no choice, but because you've built the kind of financial position where that decision belongs to you. None of that comes from income alone. Two people with identical incomes can have completely different access to those options. It comes from the gap, from building it deliberately, from protecting it from the constant socially reinforced pressure to close it. The debt trap most 9-to-5 workers fall into isn't a trap that springs all at once. It builds slowly. Upgrade by upgrade, payment by payment, default decision by default decision, and it's almost invisible right up until the moment you try to move and realize how little room there actually is. The exit from it isn't fast. It rarely is, but it starts with a single shift in how you think about the decisions you're making. Stopping the assumption that if you can make the payment, you can afford it. Because what you can technically afford in the short term and what actually serves your financial life over time are often two completely different things. Most people spend decades learning that distinction the hard way. The ones who build something different on the same income, in the same cities, doing the same kind of work, learned it earlier. Not through some secret strategy, just through the decision to stop measuring their financial life against what was normal and start measuring it against what they actually wanted. That's not a small thing. It doesn't show up on a pay stub, but over 10 or 20 years, it tends to be the thing that mattered most. There's one more layer to this worth naming. We talk about debt in terms of dollars, interest rates, balances, monthly payments. But the real cost of the debt trap isn't just financial, it's psychological. When most of your income is spoken for before you make a single choice, you start to feel like financial agency isn't really available to you. Like the numbers just do what they do. Like there's no real point in optimizing because the margin is so thin anyway. This is one of the most damaging parts of the whole pattern. Not the interest payments, though, those are real. The learned helplessness that comes from years of tight margins and limited options. It starts to feel like the ceiling is just where the ceiling is. And most people eventually stop looking at it. But the ceiling isn't fixed, it's built from decisions made months and years ago. And decisions made in the past can be replaced by different decisions made now. That's the part that matters. Not the calculation of how far behind you are, but the recognition that the structure causing the problem is something you participated in building, which means you can participate in dismantling it. It doesn't happen in a month. It doesn't happen from a single decision. It happens from a series of smaller redirects, a fixed cost renegotiated here, a commitment not renewed there, a raise that doesn't immediately translate into a bigger obligation. Compounded over time, those redirects change the picture completely. Think about what it actually looks like when someone starts to get ahead. It's rarely dramatic. There's no single month where everything flips. It's more like a slow widening, a car payment that ends and doesn't get replaced, a card that finally clears and doesn't refill, a fixed cost that gets cut, and the savings rerouted somewhere intentional. Each of those things is small in isolation. Together, they shift the structure. And once the structure shifts, the behavior follows. Because it's much easier to save consistently when the system is designed to save. Much easier to invest when there's actually margin to invest from. Much easier to stay out of new debt when the old debt isn't constantly pressuring the budget. This is why the conversation about debt can't stop at behavior. It has to go deeper to the structure underneath the behavior. Because changing behavior without changing structure is exhausting. It works for a while, then life happens, and you're back where you started. Changing the structure changes the defaults. And better defaults produce better outcomes without requiring perfect discipline every single day. Most of us were handed a set of financial defaults we never chose. Finance the car because everyone finances the car. Pay rent until you can afford a mortgage. Put it on the card and deal with it later. Upgrade when the income goes up. These aren't laws, they're habits dressed up as logic. And for a lot of people, quietly questioning them and replacing them with something more deliberately chosen turns out to be the most financially significant thing they ever do. Not a new investment strategy, not a higher income, just a different set of defaults that's worth taking seriously.